So this is for educational purposes only. Okay. Let's talk about the domestic slave trade. In March 1807, Congress enacted the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves of 1807. It ended the transatlantic slave trade effective January 1st, 1808, and it ended it in the United States of America. Do you think that ended slavery in the United States? It did not, no. So, how do you have slavery if you're not importing Africans and you don't really enslave Native Americans like that anymore? What do you do? Well, you accelerate the domestic slave trade, which had begun in 1760. Yeah, because the Act of Prohibiting Importation of Slaves said that no new slaves were permitted to be imported into the United States. It didn't say anything about selling slaves from one state to another. And fortunately for Virginia and Maryland, they weren't making money off of tobacco anymore. They had turned to wheat, which needed less enslaved people, so they had a surplus. But in the Deep South, there was a higher demand for enslaved people because of the labor intensive sugarcane and cotton. So, Virginia and Maryland turned around and they sold their surplus enslaved people to the Deep South. Who was it? Congressman Charles Fenton Mercer. That's who it was. He appreciated that Virginia derived an annual revenue of not less than $1.5 million. Yes, $1.5 million from the exportation of enslaved people. And Thomas Dew, a professor of political law at the College of William and Mary, considered the slave trade an advantage to the state. Yeah, fun fact. How do you think Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Polk made some of their money? Yes, they bred and sold enslaved people to the Deep South. Yeah, and Thomas Jefferson still died broke. Yeah, but I digress. The domestic slave trade offered many economic opportunities for white men. Those who sold their slaves realized great profits, as did the slave brokers who served as middlemen between sellers and buyers. Other white men benefited from the trade as owners of warehouses and pens in which slaves were held. Yeah. When was it? Between 1790 and 1859, slaveholders in Virginia sold more than 500,000 slaves. In the early part of the same time period, many of these slaves were sold to people living in Kentucky, Tennessee, and North and South Carolina. By the 1820s, however, people in Kentucky and the Carolinas had begun to sell many of their enslaved people as well. Maryland slave dealers sold at least 185,000 slaves. Kentucky slaveholders sold about 71,000 individuals. Most of the slave traders carried these slaves further south to Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. New Orleans, the hub of commerce, boasted the largest slave market in the United States and grew to become the nation's fourth largest city as a result. Natchez, Mississippi had the second largest market. Between the 1820s and the 1830s, the number of slaves transported across the state lines increased by 85%, reaching the point where white people forced the migration of nearly 30,000 enslaved people on average from one state to another every year. The domestic trade continued into the 1860s and displaced some 1.2 million men, women, and children. the vast majority of whom were born in America. We'll talk about slave breeding. Trafficking on such a scale was unprecedented in the United States and would never be matched again in American history. Fun fact: in 1820, slave trading became a capital offense with an amendment to the 1819 Act to protect the commerce of the United States and punish the crime of piracy. A total of 74 cases of slaving were brought in the United States between 1837 and 1860. But few captains had been convicted, and those had received trifling sentences, which they had usually been able to avoid. Nathaniel Gordon was hanged in 1862, and he was the only person to be executed for illegal slave trading in the United States.